Okay, so in this video, I'm going to just touch on some of the overview of Texas funding. Texas funding is very, very complicated. And if you've looked at either one of those documents, you'll notice that it's very, very complicated because those documents are quite lengthy. So I'm going to touch on a few of the aspects just to kind of give you a general overview on how funding in Texas works. And then you're going to produce some more of your research on your own to talk about how schools are funded in the state of Texas and also in one other state. So in general, how funding in Texas works is they take a snapshot of your attendance in October, and that becomes your average daily attendance or your ADA. So they take a look and say, okay, on October 31st, you had this many students in school, and that's what your regular programming is that you see in this top area here. Is they say you have 100 students in regular programming. That's your average daily attendance, and this is how much that they are going to receive, or the weight that's carried. So you'll notice that the weight for regular program students is smaller than the weight for other students. So first they just kind of take your average daily attendance, 100 students. Then they look at the breakdown of that 100 students. So how many of them are regular education, meaning that they're not involved in some of these other special programs, and how many are special ed, how many are in career and technology, how many are bilingual, how many students have parents in the military. So they're looking at the demographic of, let's say, those 100 students that they've captured for your average daily attendance on that date in October. And that becomes your WADA, or your weighted average daily attendance. So they're not just looking at how many students you have, but what's the composition of those students. So just to point out a few of them, and you can look at the rest of this on your own, is that special education students receive more monies than a regular education student. And that makes sense because they have special educational related services based on their IEP, or their individualized education plan. So they're going to receive more monies per student if they're in special education than if they were a regular student. Now, how much more money is going to be based on whatever disability they're categorized with. So speech, learning disability, traumatic brain injury, it all depends on what their classification is. Not actually how many services they need, it's strictly on what they're classified as. The other places that you'll see students receive more, or if you have students categorized under these programs, they'll receive more money if they're in career and technology, if they're in bilingual, if they're in gifted. But you'll notice that gifted programs don't receive as much as special education or career and technology, or even students who are pregnant. So districts receive more money for having a pregnancy program, or a program for students who are pregnant, than they would if they didn't have that program. So it's very, very complicated. So everything is just based on what types of students you have. Then in certain bienniums, they'll give additional resources for other things, like parents in the military or new facilities, but they're currently not giving additional funding for that in this biennium. So let me kind of talk to you a little bit about Robin Hood. So Robin Hood is the way that Texas is currently redistributing income. So in this first piece, it looks at a property poor district, because we know that Texas has three basic primary ways to fund education. One, through local property tax, two, through state funding, and three, through federal funding. So primarily it's through local property tax. Well, what happens if you live in a district that the property tax isn't that high? Well, here's exactly what happens. So you notice how they're calculating some of those funding structures. You've got your regular ADA, which just means your regular old kids. Then you'll see special education, mainstream, regular, residential, career and technology, on and on and on, kind of taking into account how much money is it actually going to cost to educate these children. Well, how do they determine that? The state says, hey, it costs $5,239 to educate a regular person. Where they come up with that, I don't know. So they say, here's how much money it costs to educate a basic person. And then they start multiplying that based on the weight. So it costs more money to educate special ed, and it costs even more money if you have special ed residential, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then it takes you to this final total. So for this particular district, it's telling me that it would take about $328 million to educate all the students in this district. But the school district, through property tax, was only able to raise about $117 million. So there's this deficit of $200 million approximately. So where does the rest of the money come from? Well, it's going to have to come from state funding. And where does the state get that funding? Well, that's where they get it from the wealthier districts. The wealthier districts are going to reallocate some of those funds, those extraneous funds, back to the state, and the state's going to use those funds to redistribute to the property poor districts who couldn't raise some of those monies on their own. That's kind of an overview in a nutshell. So let me have you look at a property wealthy district then. So here's the property wealthy district. So same kind of thing. Here's how many kids you have in speech therapy, in the resource room, and self-contained, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it comes up with, here's how much it's going to cost to educate the students in this district, $24 million. Well, because this particular district is wealthy, property wealthy, they were able to raise through property taxes $48 million. Well, they don't need $48 million according to the state to educate these students. So they're going to take back, or they're going to recapture that local revenue of about $24 million. And they're going to redistribute that, like I said, to the property poor districts who weren't able to raise the monies that they need through local property tax. Now, there is a lot more ins and outs. There's a lot more things that they consider in Tier 2 instructional allotment and things of that nature. So there's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of basically how the funding happens. If you continue to scroll down in this document that I provided for you, you can see the districts that are currently Chapter 41 districts, or the wealthy districts that are giving back. The state is recapturing those funds. And here you go on page 33. It starts with those Chapter 41 districts, and you're able to tell how much they actually recaptured. So let's say we take a look at Plano ISD, since probably many of you have come from Plano ISD. If I can find it on here very quickly, which I can't. But Austin ISD, they end up recapturing a lot from Austin ISD. You'll notice right up here. So in 2011, 2012, the state actually recaptured $127 million from Austin ISD. So that's pretty significant. So if you're interested, you can come back and look at pages 33, 34, and 35. Oh, there's Plano. Plano ISD, they recaptured $37 million from Plano ISD. So kind of interesting to go and see what they consider property wealthy districts in the state of Texas. So hopefully that helps a little bit to kind of give you an overview of how Texas schools are funded. And then please, continue to review the rest of the resources in this module having to do with equity and funding.